when I was writing the book, I had the good fortune to pitch Demis on this idea a week before ChatGPT dropped. Then he agreed. And so I was then embedded right from the start of this whole war. And I would go sometimes to Silicon Valley while I was doing the research, and I would check in with friends of mine who are venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, and they would say to me, Sebastian, you're writing about the wrong guy. Do you realize? I mean, he's history. No one cares about Demis anymore. No one cares about Google anymore. The race is over. OpenAI is won. That was the standard view at that time. So this is the big, fascinating moral dilemma kind of at the center of my whole story about him, right? I mean, I kind of always thought, even before I wrote a single word, that Demis might be the Robert Oppenheimer of our century, right? So this amazing scientist who is an incredible leader as well and leads something like the Manhattan Project to build this frontier transformational technology, but then regrets it because it's not safe. And that's what happened with Oppenheimer. My view is that every time you get a unicorn in Europe, of which there are now many, by definition, this means that a bunch of early hires have seen this thing scale from nothing to $1 billion from the inside. And that is the most intoxicating, exciting thing you can do in business. And people want to do it again. And so this is an exponential growth of the ecosystem. And I think nothing's going to stop Europe.
Welcome back, everyone, to EUVC. Today, Sebastian Mallaby, author of The Power Law, the VC book on most of your shelves, and now The Infinity Machine, Demis Hassabis, DeepMind, and The Quest for Superintelligence. Instant New York Times bestseller, 3 years of reporting, and 30+ hours with Hassabis directly. Sebastian's done the rounds, NPR, CFR, the works. We're not recapping any of that. Instead, we're trying to take the angle that you all want to hear. The story of a British founder who refused to move to Mountain View and who is reportedly fiercely critical of Valley leaders in private. We're going to spend the hour digging deep into the DNA of Hassabis and what we can all learn from him.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
Sebastian, welcome back on the podcast.
Great to be with you.
Congrats on the book.
Thank you.
I just asked you just before. I'm sure you've had a very hectic run these past months.
Yeah. It started in China because the Chinese do stuff faster. So although they get the manuscript last and they have to translate it, and then they want pictures, and then they want special comments from various Chinese scholars, they still publish faster. So I was there for 8 days in March talking to AI leaders and trying to promote the book. And then I came back to London, then I went to America, then I went to London, then I went to America. And so it goes. It's basically going to be, 4 months of nonstop.
That, of course, hurts a bunch to hear. And I'm sure that it also points to where your next book will be focusing. Am I right? I can imagine you've never said anything about this, at least not to me, but I feel like if anyone should write a book on where tech is headed, you have to go to China these days.
I think so. I mean, I think it's a mistake to count them out. So the Americans, when they imposed the semiconductor export embargo in 2022, were thinking they could really deprive China from powerful AI. That just failed, right? They do have powerful AI. They might be 6 months behind the frontier in America, but 6 months is not very significant. Right now, we have the whole Mythos business, a super powerful model that's good for cyber hacking. Anthropic is trying to do this new model of release where you basically don't release. You have a short list of 40, 50 institutions that get it. And the notion is that Anthropic can control cyber hacking. Well, if the Chinese also get a model, which I'm sure they will quite soon, it's going to be a different story. So I think it's a mistake to count China out.
Yeah. Sebastian, we could talk about so many things. You're also in very important fora across the world, and especially in the States, on these topics. I don't think that's where we should go today. I think we should put full focus on Hassabis and your most recent book, but maybe we should invite you back to talk more geopolitics at a later stage. Let me start where you started the book as well. Hassabis as a kid, working class, North London, immigrant family, Greek Cypriot family, father, and a Chinese Singaporean mother. He was a chess master at 5, and he turned down a 7-figure video game offer at 17 to study at Cambridge. What is it about that specific origin story that you think actually mattered for the founder he became?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it's hilarious to go to Silicon Valley and tell these people this story because they think they've got a monopoly on, young geniuses who come out of immigrant backgrounds, melting pot story. They want to found a company. They have a vision. I mean, it's just amusing to tell them that because they have to recalibrate.
And many of those stories actually originate in Europe. And,
yeah. Exactly. Yeah, that's right. But to answer your question, Andreas, I think that the important thing is, first of all, the chess circuit for Demis taught him to be very competitive. That was a super intense environment. They used to have these sort of wooden planks underneath the tables, so one kid couldn't kick the other kid during the game. It was very intense, and people would break down and burn out and so on. And so I think that, Demis would always tell me that his character was forged in that, fire of playing youth chess very intensely. Second thing is, because he was doing that, he would drop out of school for a year at a time and just teach himself in his bedroom and focus on chess. And that solitude and that sort of, learning by himself and all that turned him into somebody with a very original and personal vision. And the vision became, by 17, he wanted to build super powerful AI, which was a totally crazy idea, right? I mean, 1993, we're talking, when he's 17. He's working at this gaming company. He's not yet gone to college. And he's talking to the other game designers, including his boss, Peter Molyneux. And they're talking about, we need more AI for games to make these games more compelling, and we can build it. We're sure we can build it. And they all read Gödel, Escher, Bach, this sort of famous book from the 1990s that essentially says what the human brain can do, computer brains will be able to do in the future. And so through this strange, not going to school, not really being driven by his parents, just reading books by himself, and then showing up with this eclectic group of video game kids, living in this weird mansion outside London with this older designer who would sort of cook spaghetti for the coders at 4:00 in the morning. That's where he forged his ambition and his kind of vision for his own life. And so I think, it is in a way a classic founder story. To be a founder, you have to go against the status quo, and you have to come at it with a kind of orthogonal, original, unusual view, and an unusual upbringing probably helps that.
If we then go to 2010, where once again chess comes into play, because Hassabis and Shane Lack and Mustafa Sulaiman start DeepMind in London. And AI is still, as you just said, it's getting eye-rolling everywhere, both in academia and in business. And here's the detail then that matters most for our audience, because there's no European VC at that time that were willing to back this company. None, not a single one. Instead, he had to go and get American capital. Of course, Founders Fund famously came in with Peter Thiel, and Musk also personally, and Reid Hoffman was in the orbit around the deal. And then we had one meaningful in Europe, that was Jan Tallinn from Estonia, and then Horizon Ventures from Hong Kong. So there's almost no European money in the early DeepMind cap table. Then I want to ask you, and I have two questions here. First, if you could tell our audience the chess story, how that minute with Thiel in the Singularity Summit ended up being so important for him. And then we can go afterwards into what this tells us about the European state of investing and so on. But let's start on that chess story with Peter Thiel.
Yeah, so the chess story is cute. So what happened was that to get some funding, Demis realized that Peter Thiel was sufficiently contrarian that he might do something crazy like back an AI company before AI could even recognize the photograph of a cat. And he also knew that Peter Thiel was involved in this thing, the Singularity Summit, which was kind of a mixture of science fiction, fantasy people, and actual scientists and builders. But it was pretty weird and eclectic because at that time, AI couldn't do anything. So if you believed in powerful AI, you were kind of a dreamer. But anyway, Thiel used to finance these meetings because he was just curious to see what came out. And Demis went with his co-founders to San Francisco to one of these Singularity Summits. And actually, Thiel didn't even show up at the summit because, he funds lots of things. And, this is just another thing he funded. He didn't see the need to go there, but he would just invite the speakers over to his house for a party in the evening. And then he could meet the interesting people from the summit without having to go to the summit. So, Demis shows up at this party at Thiel's house. And he has this idea, which he's pre-planned, which is like, okay, there's going to be dozens of people pitching Thiel in some big group, and you'll get about 30 seconds to scream above the noise. So you have to make use of the 30 seconds with something surprising. And instead of pitching his idea for an AI company, he made a comment about chess. He said, the bishop and the knight have similar points ascribed to them, but very different capabilities in chess. And it's the tension between the bishop and the knight and the two different things they can do that really makes the magic and the engrossing nature of chess. This is why it's a game played over centuries. And so that was what he said to Peter Thiel in his 30 seconds. And Peter, who is himself a good chess player, not as good as Demis, but, quite good, was sufficiently intrigued by this statement that he was then invited to come back and talk more about chess the next day, to have a proper meeting. And of course, then Demis used the proper meeting to pitch his company. So it's a story really about, you just have to hook the person's attention, and it doesn't have to be about your pitch idea.
No, in the end, I think everyone who's tuning into this podcast will know we're all about the founder, and then whatever the founder will build will definitely stem from the founder's personality and the characteristics and their boldness. And for that reason, you've got everything in one 30-second line there. Now I want to ask you the harder question. What does this story tell us in 2026 that the most important AI lab of our generation possibly could not be funded by European capital in 2010, and that it required that founders fund alone ended up owning more of the company at exit than all of the three co-founders together?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not a surprise, right? It tells us that, first of all, the bargaining terms between any VC and a founder trying to do something incredibly difficult and very, very unlikely to pay off was going to favor the VC. And so the VC, in this case, put in about $2 million and got about 50% of the company, which is just a crazy deal, right? Now, to put it in perspective, if you go way, way back to sort of the very origins of venture capital on the West Coast to the 60s and even some deals in the 50s, you see also the venture capital taking a very high share of the company. So I think this is just what happens at the beginning of a story when capital is very scarce. So anyway, Thiel did this deal. And of course, you want to know, okay, why was it American? Well, because all the venture was American at the time. It's 2010. The venture ecosystem in Europe is now quite strong, but it was almost non-existent in 2010. And certainly that kind of far out, because Peter Thiel is not a normal venture capitalist. He's more contrarian than the norm. And that kind of person didn't really exist in Britain or in Europe. And so what I think is interesting, though, is that then Demis, gets them interested and wants the money, but refuses to move to California. And, the Founders Fund partnership is saying, well, why would we invest in London? I mean, you might as well invest in Somalia. It's like off the map. We don't do that. And it was just that Luke Nosek, the particular partner from Founders Fund, who had sort of fallen in love with Demis and his vision, was willing to break the mold and say, no, I want to do this. I will fly to the board meetings in London. I'm up for this. I want to be part of it. Let me do it. And then the rest of the partnership said, okay, if you really want to do it, you can do it, but you're weird. No, I think, this history as well or better than I do, but it strikes me that 2014, just to digress a bit from Demis, was the inflection point when, as I recall, TransferWise, as it was then called, had done earlier a Series A, had an offer from A16Z, had turned down the offer because the condition was you have to move to California. And then in the Series B, TransferWise said to A16Z, which still wanted to invest, yeah, but we're still going to stay in London. And at that point, A16Z said, okay, our partner will fly to your meetings in London, you can stay in London. So I always think of 2014 as the flipping point for when California-based VCs were willing to make the trip to Europe to be with a good startup. But actually, Demis pulled it off in 2010.
That's a funny story, actually. Let me ask you and tie in a string back to your Power Law book, because one of the things that the European ecosystem, of course, took offense by was how little Europe was mentioned in the Power Law. I don't want to get into a discussion whether it's right or wrong, because I think you're like the Power Law was a book about how venture got created and the early innings of venture. Hopefully, if you were to write a sequel, Europe would be a bigger part. I'd love to ask you, where do you see, because you're still very active in Europe, of course, and know a lot of people in the tech scene in Europe, what's your take on where we are today?
So I always say to people, and especially I enjoy saying this in America, is that, yeah, it's true that Europe is weak on the macro. In other words, the Draghi report is correct. We need to deepen the single market. There's too much government debt. There's too much regulation in various areas. So there are big macro problems. And by the way, I think the politics in Europe are not looking good either, with sort of populist parties doing well. But on the micro, meaning, tech startups, the tech ecosystem, venture capital. When I go to tech conferences in Europe, I'm super impressed. I think it's really good. And I think it's, my view is that every time you get a unicorn in Europe, of which there are now many, by definition, this means that a bunch of early hires have seen this thing scale from nothing to $1 billion from the inside. And that is the most intoxicating, exciting thing you can do in business. And people want to do it again. So they're going to spin out, they're going to do their own company, they're going to just be a co-founder in another company or an early hire, they're going to be an angel investor, they're going to be a VC, they're going to give back to the ecosystem somehow. And so each time you have one success story, it's basically creating the seeds for like another 10. And so this is an exponential growth of the ecosystem. And I think nothing's going to stop Europe. And every time I turn around, just this week, there was a story of a new $5 billion valuation AI company in Britain, namely the one started by David Silver, Ineffable, spinning out of DeepMind. Bang, another $5 billion, 5 times unicorn British startup. And, whether you look at, the stories in defense tech like Helsing, or you look at some of the pharmaceutical stuff like BioNTech, there's so much promising stuff going on in Europe, and it's just going to advance more and more. I almost, by the way, didn't write the Infinity Machine, this book about AI, because I almost instead started a kind of a news organization focusing on tech in Europe, which I thought would be like The Information in California, but for Europe. And because I think it was a bet that the ecosystem in Europe was just going to grow and grow and grow. And I still believe that.
Just to comment on that, because I'm a content creator in Europe and so on, the only thing I'm seeing when I'm looking at that market specifically, and I'd love to talk to you for a long time about this off the air, is we're seeing too many debt corpses when it comes to content in Europe. And I think that there are a lot of people that have not correctly diagnosed why that is, and how to then find your way as a at scale content creator in Europe. I would love to dive into that conversation with you, especially also because you have this journalist mindset of really writing deep, thorough work, which I think is also quite uncharacteristic for most people that are creating content in Europe. Now, let me ask you a different question. And I want to tie a bit here to what you mentioned about the European politics, and now it might become a bit more difficult to answer. But you are, of course, a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about what do you think about the state of European sovereignty, and do you think that we're overplaying our hand and we're focusing on things here that are not that important, but it's just because it's a bit of a, sometimes it can feel a bit like an echo chamber and we're all talking about how important this is, but fact of the matter is we're tied by the hip to the US and we got to make that work. Like, I'd love to hear your riff just freely on the back of that question.
Well, I mean, I guess the answer depends a bit on, are we talking about technology specifically or more broadly about the US, European?
Yeah, especially with the technology angle. Focusing on technology and sovereign tech and the whole defense tech sector, that's resilience and so on, that's being built up as what seems like a very viable investment proposition for a venture fund in Europe.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. So look, I do think that, Trump is both sort of an extreme outlier phenomenon because his political skills, whether you like him or not, are so off the charts that he makes stuff happen and does, Lazarus acts where he seems to be politically dead and then he comes alive again in a way that's just just incredible. So I think part of this is sort of like the weirdness of one political genius. But I also think there's deeper stuff going on in the US, and I do spend a lot of time there. And, I just think that in a way that maybe is sort of inevitable. Over time, alliances sort of get tired and the appetite to put energy into them declines, and countries just sort of grow apart. And I think, if you look at the polling evidence from just the US electorate and the drift, there always was, even in the kind of good days of the NATO alliance, a sort of American high-handedness. But I think that's just getting more and more. And I'm not sure that it would be wise for Europe, even if you had a sort of centrist Democrat elected in 2028, and that there was kind of a repeat of a Biden attempt to get closer again to Europe and be more reasonable with Europe. I just think the risk of the pendulum swinging back to a Trumpish kind of person would be quite high. And so it would behoove Europe to take sovereign technology, sovereign defense very seriously. And so I'm happy that this seems to be happening, that, companies like Helsing, but also sovereign cloud providers and sovereign defense and technology stacks, all these things I think are important and they should be pursued, and they are being pursued. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah. Okay, now I want to go back to Hassabis, of course, and I want to go a bit deep into the Google DeepMind acquisition and, of course, the subsequent brain merger. And you've said that this will be a Harvard business case study. I would love to, of course, ask you, why do you think this is and what does it teach the world? But maybe just for those that don't know, if you could line up the storyline here around the Google DeepMind acquisition.
Yeah, so the Google DeepMind acquisition, right? So this is end of 2013. There's this three-way negotiation going on, basically. So AI has started to work. You've had cats can now be recognized in photographs by AI. And DeepMind itself has created the first game-playing agent, which plays Atari games. So there's a lot of excitement in the space, and the big American hyperscalers want to get in on the game. And so Google is keen to buy DeepMind, but Meta, or which is then called Facebook, wants to buy DeepMind too. And Demis sort of plays Mark Zuckerberg off against Larry Page, decides that Larry Page is more serious about scientific research, wants to go with him. And then Elon Musk muscles in at the last moment and tries to buy DeepMind as well. But again, Demis decides that, Google is the company with the most compute. It respects scientific research. It has the cash flow to allow a lot of freedom for long-term, long-horizon research. And it was going to let Demis stay in London and have a safety oversight committee for the deployment of AI, so that it wouldn't just be Google's corporate board that got to decide how the AI was deployed. So this was sort of the premise for the sale of DeepMind to Google in January 2014. Now, quick aside, a lot of my friends in London who follow the tech sector say this is terrible. If only this great British startup could have remained independent and not sold itself to an American parent. I think that's nonsense, because it was actually a cunning way of making the Americans contribute nearly $1 billion of research and development money into London, with all the team, all the human talent, all the spillovers remaining in Britain. Fantastic. We get the American cash, but we stay in Britain. In my view, what matters, what we should look at in these deals is, where is the talent staying? And they stayed in Britain. So I think it was a great deal for Britain. All right, so then you go forward a bit. The next thing that happens is a big fight between DeepMind and Google. And this was secret. Nobody knew about it until I wrote my book. But it was called Project Mario. And it was basically Demis trying to spin out of Google. He decided that Google wasn't taking safety as seriously as it had promised. And to put pressure on Google to give him the safety oversight he wanted, he went to Reid Hoffman, again, an American investor, and said, Reid, would you back, for the good of humanity, Reid, would you back a spin out so that DeepMind's AI technology can have a proper oversight, a proper safety board? And Hoffman said, yes, I'll give you $1 billion. So they had the money to spin out, and then they were fighting with Google about whether they would spin out, whether they would get some safety oversight. And anyway, this went on for 3 years. It was quite exhausting for Demis. He would fly back and forth between San Francisco and, do these kind of grueling 11-hour flight out to San Francisco, spend 12 hours negotiating, and then come back on the next plane. So after a while of this, frankly, he just got too exhausted and gave up. He never got what he wanted. I saw these big term sheets with the spin out terms, red lines all over them from the lawyers. And there was real work that went into this, but no outcome. So then there's this slightly kind of bitter truce where Demis says, well, screw that. I'm just going to go and do some AI for science. He does this AlphaFold breakthrough, which gets him the Nobel Prize. So that's not bad. But he's basically kind of like doing his thing and trying to ignore Mountain View. And then in 2022, as you say, ChatGPT is released. And Sundar Pichai says, okay, we're going to merge the two Google AI teams. One is DeepMind in London. One is Google Brain in Mountain View. We'll put these guys together to make one powerful team. We're going to fight back against OpenAI and ChatGPT. And he put Demis in charge of it. Now, my point about the business school professor is, the business school professor would say, okay, you're telling me there's a merger in the middle of a intense technological fight when you're already behind because the other guys have released ChatGPT, and you're adding that there was this big fight between DeepMind and Google in the past. And oh, by the way, on the scientific team level, there were always fights between Mountain View and London about who got the compute to train the next model. And they would always be bitter that the other one got too much, they didn't get enough. And there's 8 time zones of difference between Mountain View and London. So how are you going to actually meld the cultures? Is this going to produce a model that can rival the OpenAI one anytime soon? Forget it. That would have been the business school professor's projection. Instead, it took 2.5 years after the merger, and by late 2025, Gemini 3.0 was better on the independent evaluations than any OpenAI model. And so that's why I think it's a case study for a future business school professor, because I think, nobody would have predicted that the merger worked as well as it did.
What do you think allowed it to work? Like, now you've spent all this time with Hassabis, you've interviewed more than 100 people around him. I'm sure that you have a good view on what were the foundations of making it work.
Yeah, so I think the answer is actually a point that generalizes to being an insight on how you do deep tech startups, right? Because deep tech startups, where you're actually doing new science, not just trying to productize existing science, it's a different kind of organizational challenge than a product-oriented startup. Because if you're doing deep science, you're trying to actually push the scientific frontier, you need to hire very smart scientists and give them a lot of freedom to explore, just pursue their ideas, and you hope that something will happen. And this is kind of the Bell Labs, at the extreme, it's the Bell Labs mentality. And that was kind of like what DeepMind had at the beginning. And it's also what Google Brain had in Mountain View. A lot of blue sky research, right? So a lot of freedom. But then if you're going to actually deliver on projects in an efficient way, you need to also have a second culture on top or in parallel. And the second culture Demis got from his background as a video game designer. He'd done his own startup after Cambridge, the first startup, which was purely a video game production startup. And he had learned the video game methodology from before he was at Cambridge. And what you do in those labs, apparently, is that you have these teams that have designers, and they have the artists and the musicians that do the music, and then they have the coders who write the code. And it's like different types of code, the graphics, the whatever. And you have to kind of meld all these people into one unified team. And you have quite strict top-down rules about how everybody contributes. And so Demis, who had done a PhD in neuroscience, so he brought the kind of blue sky research culture to DeepMind, but he also brought that top-down design to DeepMind. He called it strike teams. And what he would do is he would let his scientists explore blue sky research, all that stuff. And then now and again, he would have the scientific taste to see that there was one of the areas of inquiry that was getting to a mature point where if you just gave it a big push, in a year or two, you could get a really cool outcome like AlphaFold or AlphaGo, one of these mega projects that really put DeepMind on the map. And so then Demis would say, okay, strike team, we're going from exploration to exploitation of what we've discovered. And what he did with Mountain View when there was the merger was his people who had been trained in that special source of strike teams brought that to Mountain View. And Mountain View had never seen anything like it before. They were always used to this chaotic, let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of bottoms up development. By bringing the video game DNA, that's what turned the Google Mountain View researchers from just being good scientists who do stuff like the Transformer paper to being people who actually built Gemini 3.0. That was the transformation.
Sebastian, one question. Where did the whole safety discussion land? Because clearly he wasn't able to get it back then. Where are they today? How does Hassabis think about this today?
Yeah, so this is the big, fascinating moral dilemma kind of at the center of my whole story about him, right? I mean, I kind of always thought, even before I wrote a single word, that, Demis might be the Robert Oppenheimer of our century, right? So this amazing scientist who is an incredible leader as well and leads something like the Manhattan Project to build this frontier transformational technology, but then regrets it because it's not safe. And that's what happened with Oppenheimer. And I think Demis, although he thought about safety right from the beginning, right, the first meeting between himself and his scientific co-founder, Shane Legg, took place at a safety lecture in London. They bonded over safety, right? So they really cared about safety. And they did that secret negotiation with Google because they wanted safety. But when it comes to it, we have this race dynamic, multiple labs in multiple countries trying to build AI. And if Google DeepMind is safe, it won't make anything better because there'll be some other lab, maybe Meta, maybe some Chinese lab, whoever, that puts out open weight models, doesn't control anything, and it's not safe, right? So this is now a collective action problem, and it's not solved. And I'm very worried about that. And I think Demis is as well.
So, you've spent more than 30 hours with this man. You've called him the most competitive person you've ever met. The football anecdote alone is iconic. I'm sure you'll share that in a second. But you also describe a man who have refused to publish AlphaGo as the world's best Go program because the winning wasn't the point, solving Go was. Same with AlphaFold at CASP. And I'd love to just have you walk through this paradox. How does someone be the most competitive person on the one hand, and on the other hand, be excessively obsessed with mission-driven over money? How does this really work out in practice? What does it look like in a person when you interface with them?
Sure. Well, right. I mean, and this gets to sort of the deep questions about human nature, which you also see when you look at these genius scientists and you ask kind of what motivates them, right? If you know that you might end up as Oppenheimer, why the heck do you even do this? And different scientists in this space, or not all scientists actually, I mean, Sam Altman isn't really a scientist. He doesn't have a single degree. Different leaders, I should say, have different motivations. So I'd say that, Demis is deeply motivated by scientific curiosity. He really, really wants to understand what he calls the fabric of reality. To my astonishment, he would describe his scientific quest in religious terms or spiritual terms. He would say, to understand nature more deeply, which is what I want to do with AI, is to get closer to God or some version of God. That's how he describes it. And so this is very deep for him. And he's not really motivated by money. I mean, I once had this, I kind of grilled him. I said, you always say that, but what do you really mean? Let's just go through the list here. Like, since you became very rich, did you move house? No, I've been in the same house for like 12 years. What kind of car does your family has? I think I've forgotten what it's called, but it's 10 years old. Well, do you collect, art or whatever? Do you have a yacht, a second home? No second home, no yacht, nothing. And what luxuries do you have? Well, I do, he admitted, have a season ticket to Liverpool Football Club, and it cost about £5,000 for 2 tickets. So yes, that was a bit luxurious. I mean, he doesn't really care about money, right? But he is complicated, and all of these people are complicated. Maybe all humans are. Like inside each personality, there are 2 or 3 different personalities screaming to get out. And inside Demis, there is this curious, pure scientist. There is also a sort of social democrat, values-driven, patriotic European, who wants to do the best for humans. And that kind of gets to the open publication of the results from AlphaFold. They just gifted it to science. They didn't make any money from the system that won the Nobel Prize. And then there's just this crazy competitor. And all of them are a real part of Demis. And, you asked for the foosball anecdote. So I would go see him in this, we would talk in this pub in London. And we normally do like 2 hours at a time in this dusty room upstairs that nobody knew about. So it was just the two of us. And so we'd be sitting there with our, I want to say, no beer. Like Demis wants people to understand. When I say pub, we were actually drinking cappuccinos, okay? So we're drinking our cappuccinos and our water, and he keeps on saying, I was the best foosball player, the best table football player when I was at university. Nobody in Cambridge was better than me. And I wasn't particularly interested in this. Like, he has all these other achievements. Why do I care about table football? So I go, yeah, whatever. And he says, no, I really was, I was the best. You have to, I was the best. And I say, whatever, He says, yeah, but you don't understand. I've watched these videos of the world champion football players. You can see them on YouTube, and they don't know the snake shot. And I knew the snake shot. Maybe I invented the snake shot. I mean, you know what it is? You get hold of the lever, and you put your hand around it, and you use your whole arm, and you yank it, and the friction on your arm pulls on the lever, and you get extra spin and torque. And then the ball just goes even faster with more spin. And then nobody can play against that. And I had that shot, and the world champions don't have it. So I was the best. Like, dude, all right. I don't think I normally get into this, but he also, there was a story about how in his first startup, he put a table of football set in the shared office. And he said, nobody will ever beat me. And of course, this was a challenge to all the other coders. And then one day, one of them practiced so much that he did actually beat Demis. And as described to me by one of the other members of this startup, Demis went off and sat in a chair and kind of held his head and looked at the fool for a long time and didn't say anything. And, it's like this big black cloud had enveloped him because he'd lost a game of football. And then eventually, he looked up at the sky and said something like, my head is on fire, or something. It's super dramatic. So yeah, very competitive. So I think, sometimes people ask me, well, how does Demis reconcile that he's both very competitive and still wants the best for the society and still wants to do science for the sake of science? And I'm like, yeah, he's complicated. He doesn't reconcile. He just has all those three personalities at once.
Let me ask you about this strong social democratic values that you're describing as well. He, of course, famously refused to relocate to Mountain View, partly because he sees Britain as more egalitarian. And then he tells you that he's actually quite unhappy seeing these 5 to 10 firms that are absorbing all the wealth and power of the AI revolution. Because basically, he would want AI to be used for more egalitarian purposes. I want to ask you, do you believe in what he says? Because at the same time, he is also at the forefront, at the biggest of the hyperscalers, running full steam ahead, accumulating more and more power to Mountain View.
Yeah. So, look, I think it's important to stipulate that it's true. He doesn't like the fact that 5 to 10 labs are building frontier AI. But it's not that he wants there to be 100 or 200. He actually is the opposite. His vision would be one lab, preferably headed by himself. And the reason he says that is that then it wouldn't be a race. And if it wasn't a race, we could, really test the models before we release them to the public. We could go slow. We could be careful. We could even, just hold up releases while we do alignment research. And so we only release it with better alignment technology. And so his vision is kind of European in the sense that it's like a CERN type vision where you unite, this nuclear research under one roof. So it's a sort of centralizing view. Now, that's not how things have turned out, because when you have this godlike technology, there are going to be, multiple labs in multiple countries that want to try to build it, and it's not just going to be one. It just isn't how humans function, right? People are tribal and jealous and competitive. They don't just magically unite into one global effort in unity. So Demis's vision is impossible, and the fact that he even had that vision shows that he has blind spots, that he can be naive. But anyway, we are where we are. We have these multiple labs in the race. Now the question is, I think, your second part of your question is, well, so why is he participating in this? Because it's not what he believes is safe. And I think the answer is, yeah, but he wouldn't make it safer by quitting. Like if he left the position at Google DeepMind and went to take a professorship somewhere, and somebody else just carried on running Google DeepMind, the world would not be safer. In fact, I think it would be less safe, because at least with Demis in that chair, you do have somebody who genuinely has a track record of wanting to try to make it safe, as evidenced by the fact that he spent 3 years fighting tooth and nail with Google to get safety, as evidenced by the fact that he also had the idea, which he gave to Rishi Sunak, for a, AI safety conference at Bletchley Park in 2023, where people from all around the world came. And it was the start of what I see as a necessary discussion to get to global agreement on non-proliferation for AI. So I think he is genuine in his safety ambitions, but he just can't do it by himself because there's a race.
Yeah. Sebastian, I want to ask you about a different point in time and something that I think many of us are thinking about and not fully understanding, which is, of course, Google's reaction to ChatGPT and what happened in those pivotal months. I'd love to ask you, we have these 6 months where we got ChatGPT. It felt like Google was scrambling. They launched Bard, which I think many of us have already forgotten about. Now it's called Gemini. What's the version of this period that you learned through talking to Demis? What did that teach you? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I mean, when I was writing the book, I had the good fortune to pitch Demis on this idea a week before ChatGPT dropped. So, then he agreed. And so I was then embedded right from the start of this whole war. And I would go sometimes to Silicon Valley while I was doing the research because, somebody would want me to speak about my power law book in Silicon Valley, whatever. And I would check in with friends of mine who were venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. And they would say to me, Sebastian, you're writing about the wrong guy. Do you realize? I mean, he's history. No one cares about Demis anymore. No one cares about Google anymore. The race is over. OpenAI has won. That was the standard view at that time. And, I would say, well, I'm not so sure. I think time will tell and blah, blah, blah. And they would go, yeah, whatever. You're smoking something. This is game over. And meanwhile, when I talked to Demis, what I saw was this steely determination. So I said to him, okay, this is what they say in Silicon Valley. What do you say? And he said, look, ChatGPT, OpenAI, they parked the tanks on my lawn. This is war. And you could see that kind of massively competitive side coming out. And he said, anyway, people think that I'm just a scientist. I do AI for science. I do AlphaFold, protein folding, but they've forgotten. What they've forgotten, Sebastian, is that I also did video games in the past and I know how to ship product. And I've studied what Steve Jobs did with all his product rollouts. I understand this game and I'm very good at it. And, I can do either. I can do science and great science and Nobel level science, if that's what you want me to do. I can also do product. You wait. So that was his view. And, I waited, I watched, and I think it was a bit chaotic at first. But as it turned out, as I was saying earlier, this was sort of a business school case study in making the merger work. And I think, it wasn't just Demis who made it work. He has a great team, people like Koray Kavakçoglu, who's been his sort of chief scientist or chief, maybe, I guess he's called head of research, for a long time at DeepMind, moved last year to go live in Mountain View and make the merger really work as best as possible. So there are other people who deserve credit, but all in all, it has worked. And I would say that Demis' relationship with Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, is probably the most important buddy act in global business right now, because you've got, Sundar needs Demis because Demis is delivering the AI, and Demis needs Sundar because he's delivering the money and resources for him to build the AI.
We could think a ton about and talk a ton about the future of AI is headed. I don't think there's any point in and whether Google is going to win it or it's going to be Anthropic, because 3 months ago everyone was writing off Anthropic, and now they're all the rage. So
yeah, exactly. I agree. It's not worth trying to predict.
No, exactly. Yeah. So now, instead of doing that, I want to ask you, and I'm going to quote a small thing from your book here, which is that you write that Hassabis deals with the valley and takes its money, but he's remained outside of it and is furiously critical of it, often lambasting its leaders in his conversations with you. I'd love to ask you, like, without breaking confidence, of course, what is the European founders' case against Silicon Valley as Hassabis makes it to you in private?
Well, it's basically that, there should be more to frontier science than shipping products. And this is a specific criticism which I think, pertains to something which has the power that AGI has, right? I mean, I think his view is, look, if you just want to produce another app to go in the App Store, Silicon Valley is great. I mean, it's very good at that. It ships product fast. There's a great venture ecosystem. We want to have the same in Europe because we admire Silicon Valley. We're trying to do the same as that. It's not that we're against Silicon Valley. We just want to have our own one. But when you're doing something as consequential as AGI, which is going to change the way everybody lives and, how they bring up their kids, how they do their jobs, how they think of themselves as human, because there's now a rival form of cognition, which is taking away the uniqueness of being a human intelligent being. This is so fundamental and so potentially dangerous that just to ship product as if you're doing another app is wrong. And I think what he sees in Sam Altman, or what he sees in some of the venture capitalists who back the sort of upstart challengers and who basically just want to throw money at open weight projects, is I think he's ambivalent about that stuff. And as you know, Google DeepMind does have a strong suite of open weight models called Gemini, and they are proud of them. I think that's a bit of a contradiction of what Demis really believes should be done, because I think that, open weight is dangerous. And so therefore I'm actually critical of Mistral, I'm critical of Meta, I'm critical of Cohere, I'm critical of all the Chinese labs. And I think ultimately, when you do an open weight model, first of all, the person who uses it can remove safeguards. And second, if they start to do a cyber attack or something other terrible thing, there's a chance that if it's from an API, the model provider sees this happening and can cut it off, as has happened in the case of a cyber attack in Mexico, where both OpenAI and Anthropic saw that their model was being used. They cut off the cyber attack. Now, if you just allow people to download the weights and use the model in their own server with no connection to the provider anymore, you've lost that ability. So why would you give that up? I just think that we're getting to a point with Mythos and so forth where AI is getting too dangerous for this to be a smart way forward. So I don't like what's happening with Mistral, for example. And I think, the logic of Demis's view, having talked to him for more than 30 hours, is that he also shouldn't like these open weight providers, and yet they provide their own open weight. But to go back to your question about what is the critique of Silicon Valley, I think it is that simply, this is a very consequential technology which is going to change the world. It shouldn't just be a crude, vulgar race where people just want to win some sort of race. They want to tweet out their product before they've even released it. They want to throw money at some starter, some new startup. If he also complains that, there's too much noise. That phrase would come up a lot in my discussions with him. Too much noise, Sebastian. I'm going, what do you mean? He said, well, I want people to be really thinking, to be doing proper science, deep research, really making progress, breaking through, big barriers to our progress in AI. And they're not going to do that if they're in Silicon Valley. It's hard to do that because everybody's looking over their shoulder and saying, oh, my former colleague just started his own startup and raised $500 million. Maybe I should do that too. And there's just too much distraction from actual knowledge creation in his view. And then I'll just say one more thing about this. I do think that, when I go visit the DeepMind office in King's Cross in London, I come out of the tube in King's Cross. I walk through this kind of trendy area of boutiques. I go across a little bridge where there's a canal. In the summer, there are movies by the canal where kids can watch the movies for free. And then there's a art school, a design school, Central St. Martin's, where there's sort of a fountain that bubbles up through the cobblestones. And kids can run around, 3-year-olds can run around with their socks and shoes off in the fountain, laughing and screaming with delight in this public space. And then you go beyond that and you get to some more trendy shops, and then you get to the DeepMind office, and next to it there is this green patch of grass. And I've seen in the summer, the kids from the local government housing, playing football on the green grass right by the DeepMind office. Show me the place in Sandhill Road where this kind of public space exists. It does not exist. It does not. It's all like, don't trespass. And I think that is sort of a vibe which Demis really likes. And so do I. I get it, right? And maybe some American cities have a bit of that, but in general, America is not that good at it.
Yeah. I actually wanted to ask you just before about your own views. You got into them and you spoke about Mistral and open weight, especially there with a lot of passion. I'd love to ask you about, and we spoke about sovereignty earlier, but we didn't mention AI specifically in the sovereignty discussion. I think it would be interesting to hear your take on Europe's frailty or lack of independence when it comes to AI, because we have yet to stand up a serious data center, to be honest. We don't have the compute. We have, like everyone I ask, say it's very hard to see even that we will have a serious amount of compute in 3 or 5 years. It's even further down the line. How do you think about that? We're obviously quite behind, but what worries me more is it's very hard to see a good path for the next 5 years.
Yeah. I think there is, I'm going to maybe not remember the name right, but I believe Vertex is a European sovereign cloud provider based out of Eastern Europe, maybe Finland or Estonia. I should remember the name because, full disclosure, I actually wrote a seed check, or not a seed check, I wrote a check into it, partly because I do believe in all these sovereign initiatives in Europe. And I've only ever done about, 3 checks in my life, but that was one of them. So maybe we'll be able to make progress with building a sovereign European cloud. But I think that the way I see the AI ecosystem globally, evolving in an ideal world is that I think we need to recognize that, AI of the sort that is about to emerge in the hands of people who have bad intentions, whether they are terrorist groups or rogue states or what, that's just something we don't want, because the cyber attack danger is serious. Bioweapon danger is serious. And so it's like nuclear material. We want civilian nuclear power to be available around the world for all kinds of governments that need power. We don't want all these governments necessarily to be making weapons, because it just creates an arms race and is destabilizing. And we definitely don't want the nuclear weapons to be in the hands of Al-Qaeda or some terrorist group, right? And I think with AI, we need to come up with an AI version of the Non-Proliferation Treaty where, sure, France wants its own AI. France should be able to have its own AI that's kind of trained on French data, respects French culture, puts French, the French tradition kind of front and center in the training set. All of this I completely respect. But I think we need to have a non-proliferation agreement where governments that do this sort of sovereign AI are doing it under the safe conditions that have globally been agreed. Like, what is the red teaming before you release the model? There should be no open weights. It's just too dangerous. And there should be a bunch of these rules about safety. And everybody has to sign up to these rules in order to get the sovereign AI.
I think you speak a lot of truth there, and I think it's incredibly important that we in Europe get ahead of this agenda. Sebastian, we're up on time. You've just authored the Infinity Machine. We've spoken a bunch about it here. I can tell you it's 15 hours packed with insights on AI and how Hassabis, as a founder, thinks and as a leader leads. I would definitely advise anyone to go and get it. I personally am listening to it right now. Unfortunately, this one is not read by you narrated by you on Audible. Am I correct? Because I only listened to the first part and that was not.
Yeah, no, I don't tend to. I've never read my own books. I think there are actors who are good at that.
It was actually, okay, then it was actually probably because I listened to, when we did the Power Law, I listened to the Power Law book the days before we did our recording. And then we had our 2-hour conversation on how much it was back in the days, which I'm sure is then why I'm tying your voice perfectly into that book. Okay, everyone out there, you will not be enjoying Sebastian's beautiful European accent, unfortunately. Instead, you'll get American who's reading and narrating for you. Sebastian, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I hope our audience will be much wiser about how Hassabis thinks today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.